Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll learn to become a better, more business-savvy designer so you can dominate your competition. Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Grotzer, and this episode of Design Domination is all about alt text for images. Stick around to find out why alt text is important, which images should and should not have it, whose responsibility it is to write it, how to add it, and mistakes people make with alt text. Real quick, I just want to say I can't believe it, but this is episode 100. I mean, I really can't believe it. And I also, this is kind of like great timing. I also just found out that Design Domination was chosen by FeedSpot as one of their top 25 design podcasts. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to you for listening and tuning in. I really appreciate your time. I was terrified of starting a podcast. I know I had a lot to say. I didn't know that anybody would want to be listening to me. Okay, so let's dive in. A lot of designers, web designers and document designers, have heard of alt text and know what it is, but they don't really fully understand it or how to write it. So I'm going to break it down for you. First off, let me briefly get into what alt text is in case you don't know about it. Alt text is short for alternative text, and it provides a text description of an image. A lot of web designers and developers incorrectly refer to this as alt tags, but it's incorrect because it isn't a tag at all. Alt is an attribute. In HTML on a website, you add the alt attribute to an image tag, the IMG tag. And with documents, alt text is applied to an image in a program such as Adobe InDesign, Microsoft Word, or Adobe Acrobat. And there's others. It appears in a figure tag in an exported PDF. Alt text can be applied to images on most social media platforms as well. There are so many benefits to alt text when it's used properly. Alt text helps people with low to no vision, which is important because they cannot see images well or at all. Many of these people use a screen reader, which will read the alt text out loud to them. Alt text also helps people who have images turned off due to having a slow internet connection, or just because they want to save data. They'll see the alt text before the images load, or instead of seeing the images at all. Of course, that depends on whether or not the images have alt text. When done properly, alt text also helps with search engine optimization, SEO. And that's because search engines cannot see the content of an image. They cannot tell what it's an image of. When you add alt text to an image, it tells the search engines what the image says, if it's an image of text, or what it's about. Now, apparently, search engine image recognition technology can try to interpret the content of an image, from what I understand, but there's a lot of room for error there, and that could affect how a page ranks. They are also not going to describe things using certain words that you might want to use, or including people's names, for example. Images with alt text will show up in Google search results for images, and there are a lot of people searching images to find what they want. There's some research that shows that more than 85% of people shopping online for clothes or furniture put more importance on visual information than they do on text information. This might be product images, but it could also be photos and customer reviews. Images build trust with them. So you can see how important that would be for any business, a speaker or an author, anyone, especially for businesses selling any kind of products online. A lot of web designers and developers wonder who is responsible for writing the alt text. After all, if you're the one designing and building the website, shouldn't you be the one to write the alt text too? Not necessarily. Of course, if you have an agreement with the client to provide the alt text, well, you need to do that. But accessibility is everyone's responsibility, not just yours because you're working on their document or website. They might not understand how to write it, but you may not know enough about the subject matter to understand what to write for it either. So you might need to get their input on that. You can provide guidance, or you can write it and get their feedback. Now, which images need alt text? Not all images need to have alt text, and this usually surprises many designers, and that's probably because you're always hearing you need to add it, which is because so many images on websites and in documents that should have alt text are missing it. It mostly comes down to this. Is this a decorative image, or does it convey meaning? Decorative images do not need alt text. Images that convey meaning and should get alt text are usually logos, images of text, images that convey information, images being used as hyperlinks or buttons, icons that are not decorative, such as a menu icon or social media icons, and simple data graphics. Now, this is a very general statement. There are also scenarios where you wouldn't use alt text for some of these. Context is key in deciding whether or not to add alt text. Not only that, but there are also better methods to address some of these elements than by using alt text. Sometimes you have to spend some time understanding the page content before making the determination of whether or not something needs alt text, or if there's a better alternative. In other words, you have to see how it's being used. The same image could have alt text on one page and maybe should be ignored on another page. To give you an example, as part of some remediation work, and remediation means to make something accessible. As part of this work, a client recently asked us to add the alt text that we had come up with to the images in Adobe Bridge. And that way, the alt text would be consistent and in place for them, and they wouldn't need to rewrite anything when they use these images. The issue with this, as I explained to them, was that in some cases, they might need to remove the alt text, or maybe even modify it. Another issue was that we did not add alt text to some of the images because of how they were being used in that one project we worked on. But that's not to say those images shouldn't get alt text if used elsewhere. When it comes to writing good alt text for images, it's not an exact science. There's a lot of gray area, and it depends on how the image is used and maybe even the nature of the document or the website. For instance, whether it's for a museum or a clothing store, a coffee shop, or a consulting business. It's also very easy to get alt text wrong. Again, context is key, and like I said earlier, you might have to spend some time in the document or on the web page getting an idea of the content before you start writing alt text for the images there. Now, having said that, it's much easier to write the alt text as you're working on a document or website than it is to come back later and do it. You want to describe the image for anyone who cannot see it, pretty much. The goal is for them to have the same understanding of the image as people who are able to see the image, just in text form. What you use for alt text on images on an art, photography, or museum website would be very different from what you'd use on the same images on another type of website. It's just not one size fits all. Now, for images of text or even logos, it's much more straightforward. You simply include the same text that is in the image. No embellishing, though. Now, how long alt text should be is another factor to consider. Alt text should be short and to the point. More is not necessarily better. Alt text cannot be paused while being voiced by a screen reader. So if you have, for example, alt text on a complex infographic that gives all the details and some data, no one's going to be able to comprehend all that information in one fell swoop. A good rule of thumb is anywhere from a few words to a few sentences. Some people suggest that alt text shouldn't exceed 125 characters. Others recommend 250 characters. I have some clients with their own internal guideline for alt text length, which I've had to use, and those usually dictate a shorter length. It's good practice to add a period at the end of the alt text, so screen readers will pause. It's not required, but it just makes it more user-friendly. As I said earlier, it's easy to get alt text wrong. I see a lot of web designers, developers, and clients making a lot of mistakes with alt text. The first mistake is using redundant text. Using redundant text is an annoyance to users of screen readers. And what I mean by redundant text is if you add text to the alt text saying it's an image. Someone using a screen reader will already know it's an image and will hear the word image or graphic. However, it might be good to tell them that the image is an illustration, a chart, or a graph. Another way to avoid redundancy is to not use the same text for the caption, if there is one. Another problem is insufficient alt text. A lot of people will write insufficient text that doesn't say enough about what's in the image. Let's say you have a map image. Using map of whatever for the alt text might be insufficient. Why is that map there? Just to show a map? To tell people how to get around somewhere? Think about the purpose that it's serving by being there. Another mistake I often see with alt text is describing something artistically or visually. Now, in a few cases, that might actually be what you should do. But for the most part, you want to avoid describing images that way. For instance, I've had clients want to describe a pie chart visually with the colors used and talking about the pie pieces. So like the blue pie piece represents 25%. The green pie piece represents 15%, and so on. First off, how the pie chart looks isn't important. Only the data it's conveying is important. Second, someone who has had blindness or color blindness their entire life won't know what the colors are. Yet another common mistake I see with alt text is including more information than the sighted user is getting. An example of this could be describing the photo of a person in a thoughtful pose, which is fine. But adding in some text about what they're thinking about goes well beyond what someone can see when looking at that image. Another example I've seen is adding a credit line, like for a photographer, in the alt text, and it doesn't appear anywhere else. Sometimes I come across alt text that is incorrect altogether. It doesn't make sense at all for the image. Maybe there's a photo of a dog, but the alt text says something about a cat. A lot of web designers and developers think that background images, like when they're on the web placed with CSS, that they don't need alt text. But not all background images are decorative. So like I said earlier, it depends on the context. And how you address them would be different. A lot of web designers and developers think that alt text is a good opportunity to stuff keywords into their images to help their SEO. If the keyword makes sense, that's one thing. But if you're just stuffing a bunch of keywords into the alt text, that doesn't help with SEO and it doesn't help users. A lot of people will add hyperlinks to alt text. That's fine, but you have to know that alt text doesn't allow for clickable hyperlinks. So if you go stick in a long URL, someone would have to remember it or write it down. Okay, so now that I've gone into all of those things, how the heck do you add the alt text to an image? Well, there's different ways to do it depending on which program you're using for document layout, or if you're doing it to an image on a website. Now, I'm just going to focus on InDesign in terms of document design. So if you're working on a document in InDesign, go to the image, right-click it, and select Object Export Options. Make sure the Alt Text tab is selected in the dialog box, and then choose Custom from the drop-down menu. And then just add the alt text. Now, I found that InDesign doesn't always save the alt text, and I guess it's a random bug, but it's quite frustrating. So I'll put a copy of it on the pasteboard just in case, or in a text file. You can also automatically apply alt text from an object style. So create an object style or edit one, and then go to Export Options, and then alt text. And then for alt text source, choose XMP description. This will pull it in from Adobe Bridge if you already have the text set there. I demonstrated how to add alt text to an image in InDesign in a video on the InDesign Secrets YouTube channel. Check the show notes for the link to that. Now, to add alt text to an image on a website, you simply put the alt text in the alt text field on the image in the media library, if you're using WordPress, and then insert the image onto the page. If the image already has been inserted on the page, you'll need to add the alt text to the code of the image on the page, or you'll need to reinsert the image. On the image tag, the IMG tag, add alt equals quote quote, and then put the alt text in between the quotation marks. It doesn't matter where inside the image tag you add it, to the beginning, the middle, or the end. Okay, so now let's talk about how to mark an image as decorative so it will be ignored by a screen reader and other assistive technology. Whether it's in InDesign versus on a website, it's actually called two different things. In InDesign, it's called artifacting. In InDesign, you artifact an image by going to the Object Export Options, the ones I mentioned earlier. But instead of selecting the Alt Text tab, select Tagged PDF, and then Artifact from the drop-down menu. You can also apply an artifact from an object style. This can really speed up your workflow. I show how to artifact an image in InDesign in that same video on the InDesign Secrets YouTube channel. Now, on a website, it's very different. You want to have an alt attribute. You must have an alt attribute, but it should be empty. So it should just be alt equals quote quote. And this is also called null alt text. In the WordPress media library, you might see the option to mark the image as decorative, and that does the same thing. But for any images that have already been inserted on a page, you'll need to manually change the code or, again, reinsert the image. I hope this information was helpful. There's more to know about alt text, especially when dealing with maps, complex infographics, bar charts, pie charts, or line graphs, for example, lions and tigers and bears. But this should give you a strong start to understanding and writing alt text for images. Be sure to go to the episode page at creative-boost.com/podcast and get the links that I mentioned in the show notes, including the link to download my free guide, Alt Text Made Easy.